Wednesday marked 10 years since the deadly movie shooting in Aurora, Colorado. 12 people died when the gunman opened fire during a midnight showing of the Batman film The Dark Knight Rises. Nearly 60 others were injured in the attack. It was the deadliest mass shooting in Colorado since 1999, the Columbine shooting in which 12 high school students and a teacher were murdered. Daniel Oates was Aurora's police chief at the time. He recently returned to the job as interim chief of the department. He was sworn in 2 days after the shooting in Uvalde and almost immediately changed the department's policy on active shooter situations. Oates says officers must take all reasonable and necessary actions to stop the threat. Aurora Police Chief Daniel Oates joins me now. Chief Oates, thank you so much for being with us. You served as police chief from 2005 to 2014. This was obviously a deeply significant incident in your career. How, over the last 10 years, has it affected the way you think about police work?
Well, I think it's changed the profession tremendously. You know, believe it or not, there was a time when these events were fairly rare, and 10 years ago, they still were. Aurora stands for a number of things. One of the most significant was the manner in which our cops handled the severely wounded. We had trouble getting paramedics to where the wounded were, and a young sergeant about 8 minutes into our event made the decision that saved so many lives, which was to put 27 of the most severely wounded into patrol cars and race them to hospitals rather than trying to connect them with paramedics and ambulances, which we couldn't do. From Aurora came sort of a lesson for all of American policing that to train cops in tactical combat care, stop the bleeding care, and also to better coordinate responses, the efforts by paramedics, firefighters, and cops to get the paramedics to where the wounded are. So in terms of the profession, our event was very significant. In terms of over the 10 years and the aftermath, we've seen so many horrors since and so much more frequency. You know, I always tell people, until you're part of a community that's been victimized in this way, and the entire community is victimized, you don't quite understand the conversation, for instance, around gun policy and access to weapons and those kinds of things. Communities who have been through this, I think, in general, think very differently about those issues.
Tell me what you mean, Chief. How do they think differently?
I'll describe it this way. Our event was so cataclysmic. Everybody, and this was a city at the time of 350,000 people, virtually everywhere I went, every day for the rest of my time here, the 2 years that I was here after the event, I met someone who knew someone who was in that theater. There were 1,100 people in the building. There were 300 people in the theater. This entire community was deeply, deeply affected. And we slipped into the aftermath, as you would expect, this deep depression as a community. And we were just climbing out of it 6 months later when Sandy Hook happened. And of course, that was even more traumatic to the American community, you know, the American society than our event. And there was this deep depression in our community, again, because we saw what another community was going through and felt it yet again. Our event was in July of 12. Sandy Hook was in December of 12. And if you're a community that's been through this, you feel it every single time. And you feel that absolute horror and grief and torment to see another community torn up the way yours was.
So what you're describing is an accumulative effect of this across all these towns that we've unfortunately become familiar with in the last 10 years. Let me ask you a question as a police officer, and everybody is now, or people have seen the video from Uvalde. What should they have done? I guess what I would love is your perspective on how I should think a police officer should respond when there is a hallway filled with that many number of rounds coming at you. And if that is now then something every police officer has to think about being more likely, how do you think that affects recruitment? Now, knowing now that running down a hallway with that kind of fire coming back at you is going to be possibly part of your job.
Well, that's a really interesting question because, you know, the narrative in American policing in the last 5-6 years is that we need to change how we recruit and how we train, and we need to recruit for guardians, not for warriors. And this is whole effort, and it's understandable in light of some of the things that have happened in recent years and the pressure around reform, the post-George Floyd era. And that's all true. And enlightened police leaders need to believe in that, and they need to send that message. But we also have to send a message that there is a time in every American police officer's life when you need to be a warrior. And this is that moment. And training across our profession has gotten really good in this regard. It's hard to watch, painful to watch the Uvalde videos, and I don't like to second guess command on the scene for these kinds of events. But, we train, and in every department I've been in over the years, we train to aggressively go and eliminate the threat at all costs. In fact, when I got here for this second stint about 6-7 weeks ago, I took a look at our active shooter policy, and I was troubled to see that it didn't explicitly make clear that if you are the lone single first responder and there is active shooting going on, you go in and you address the threat. And I actually went and changed policy. And that stemmed from when I was in Miami Beach as the chief from 14 to 19, just 35 miles south of Parkland, where some of my cops had kids in that school, where that response did not occur by the single officer who was the single deputy who was on the scene. Yeah. And those of us in Miami-Dade, leaders in Miami-Dade, we went back to our policies and changed them to make it explicitly clear. You go in and you address the threat, even if you are by yourself. Obviously, the better way to go is to form up teams when folks arrive. But eliminating the shooting, eliminating the threat is the #1 job in these kinds of situations, and it requires a warrior.
Let me ask you as a final question, Chief. A Colorado judge ruled Monday that 5 former Aurora police officers and paramedics involved in the 2019 death of Elijah Mclean can now face criminal charges. What's your take on that decision?
Well, obviously, it's the right decision in light of the indictment, where we stand with regard to that. And, that's an example of another thread going through in American policing, and that is how are we handling, street encounters in a way that's constitutional, proper, respectful, properly assesses the information that's available to officers at the time. And, here that is another trauma in our community, is the death of Elijah Mclean, and our court system and our legal process is dealing with it. And the decision this week by the court was essentially that there is enough evidence to proceed to trial. And those paramedics and police officers and our community will all get the day in court over that matter.
All right, Chief Dan Oates, we really appreciate you being with us. Thank you.
Thank you, John.